On a sticky July afternoon in London, the kind where the air feels thick enough to chew, the usual bustle around Buckingham Palace swelled with tourists from every corner of the globe. Families with sunburnt shoulders, backpackers snapping selfies, school groups trailing behind tired chaperones, all drawn to the grandeur of the monarchy. The pageantry, the living postcard that is the changing of the guard. Near the railings, a line of soldiers stood perfectly still in their crimson tunics and towering bearskin hats, eyes fixed straight ahead, hands clasped around the hilts of their ceremonial swords. To most onlookers, they were statues in uniform, symbols, not people. But they were very much human, sweating under wool coats in 90-degree heat, shifting weight subtly from one foot to the other when no one was looking, counting the minutes until relief arrived. Among them was a young corporal whose stillness ran deeper than discipline. He'd been stationed there before, many times, but today felt different. Maybe it was the humidity pressing down like a damp blanket. Maybe it was the way some of the onlookers stared a little too long, their expressions unreadable. Or maybe it was the low hum of tension he'd sensed all morning, the kind that prickles the back of your neck even when nothing's visibly wrong. He didn't flinch when a child tugged at his tunic or when a tourist's selfie stick bumped his arm. He'd trained for this, the silence, the immobility, the weight of expectation. What he hadn't trained for was hatred. A few yards away, leaning against a lamppost with a crumpled paper bag in hand, stood a man who didn't belong in the cheerful chaos of the palace grounds. He was in his late 20s with greasy hair, bloodshot eyes, and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. He'd been muttering to himself for the past 20 minutes, loud enough that a few passers-by had edged away. At first it was just grumbling, complaints about the heat, the crowds, the bloody tourists. But then his voice sharpened, dipped lower, turned venomous. He kept glancing toward the line of guards, his gaze narrowing each time it landed on one in particular, the corporal. The corporal didn't notice at first. His training taught him to look through people, not at them. But others did. A woman from Manchester visiting with her daughter tugged her child closer and whispered, "Let's move over there, love." A French couple exchanged uneasy glances and stepped back. Still no one intervened. No one called security. In a city as vast and fast-moving as London, odd behavior often gets ignored, chalked up to eccentricity, drunkenness, or just another Tuesday. But this wasn't eccentricity. This was something darker. The man took a swig from his paper bag, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and pushed off the lamppost. He weaved through the crowd like a shark parting minnows, his eyes locked on the corporal. People instinctively parted for him, sensing something off, something dangerous. He stopped just outside the velvet rope that marked the boundary between public and ceremonial space. For a long moment he just stood there, breathing hard, jaw clenched. Then, without warning, he lunged. It happened so fast that half the crowd didn't register it until it was over. 1 second, the corporal was standing at perfect attention. The next, the man had grabbed the hilt of his sword and yanked it free with a metallic shriek that cut through the afternoon chatter like a siren. Gasps erupted. A child screamed. Phones shot up, recording. The thief stumbled back, holding the gleaming blade aloft like a trophy, his face twisted in a mix of triumph and rage. "You don't belong here," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This uniform? This sword? It's for real Brits, not you." The words landed like stones. Silence fell over the square, thick and suffocating. Tourists froze mid-step. Pigeons scattered. Even the traffic on the nearby road seemed to hush. The corporal didn't move, not a muscle. His face remained blank, but his eyes, those dark, steady eyes, locked onto the man with a calm so profound it was unnerving. He didn't reach for the sword, didn't shout, didn't even blink. He just stood there, empty-handed, while the weight of centuries of service, sacrifice, and silent endurance pressed down on his shoulders. In that moment, he wasn't just a soldier. He was every black man who'd ever been told he didn't belong in a space he'd earned. He was every veteran who'd bled for a country that sometimes acted like it didn't want him. And yet his training held. His dignity held. He would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing him break. Within seconds, 2 other guards broke formation, not with aggression but with swift, practiced precision. They moved like shadows, flanking the thief before he could take another step. One placed a firm hand on his shoulder. The other extended a gloved palm for the sword. The man hesitated, his bravado flickering as reality set in. He looked around, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes on him, the sea of phones capturing his every move. The sword, heavy and unfamiliar in his grip, felt less like a weapon and more like an anchor dragging him down. He dropped it. The blade clattered onto the cobblestones with a sound that echoed like a gong. The guard retrieved it without a word, wiped the hilt on his tunic and returned it to its scabbard with a quiet click. The thief stood trembling, his chest heaving, his earlier fury replaced by something closer to panic. Before he could say another word, plainclothes officers emerged from the crowd, police who'd been monitoring the scene since the first shout. They cuffed him gently but firmly, leading him away as murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Did you see that? Was that racist? Why didn't the guard do anything? The questions flew, but no one asked the corporal what he was feeling. No one asked if he was okay. They snapped photos of him like he was part of the scenery again, as if the attack had never happened. He remained at his post for another 43 minutes, until the official relief arrived. His expression unchanged, his posture perfect. Only those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tremor in his gloved hands, or the way his breath came just a little too fast. Later, in the barracks, stripped of his uniform and sitting alone on a narrow cot, the weight of it all crashed over him. Not the theft, that was just metal, but the words, the intent, the casual cruelty of being told you're an imposter in your own life. He thought about his grandfather, who'd served in the British Army during the war, only to be told upon returning home that his medals didn't count the same because of where he was born. He thought about his father, who'd worked double shifts as a bus driver just to afford his school uniform. And he thought about himself, 18 years old when he enlisted, wide-eyed and proud, believing that service would earn him respect, that loyalty would be enough. Now, sitting in the dim light of the changing room, sweat still cooling on his skin, he wondered if he'd been naive. But beneath the hurt, something else stirred. Not anger, at least not the kind that burns hot and reckless. This was colder, sharper, a resolve. He wouldn't let this moment define him. He wouldn't let a drunk man's hate erase decades of his family's quiet contributions to this country. If anything, it lit a fire in him, a need to be seen, truly seen, not as a symbol or a target, but as a man with a story worth telling. Outside, London carried on. Buses rumbled. Tourists laughed. The palace gates gleamed under the setting sun. But inside that quiet room, a decision was made. One that would ripple far beyond that stolen sword, far beyond that humid afternoon. The corporal didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning, and what happened next would surprise everyone, even him. The arrest happened so fast that by the time most people processed what they'd seen, the man was already gone, swallowed by the back of a police van that pulled away with quiet efficiency. But the moment itself, that stayed. It looped endlessly on phones, laptops, news sites, social feeds. Within hours, the video had millions of views, not because a sword was stolen, that alone might have been a quirky headline, but because of what came with it. The raw, ugly burst of racism, the guard's unnerving stillness, the way time seemed to stop in that square like the whole city was holding its breath. Online, the reaction split like a river hitting a rock. One side flooded with outrage. "How dare he?" That guard showed more restraint than I ever could. "This is why we need to protect our institutions." The other side twisted the story, downplaying it as just a drunk guy or worse, suggesting the guard should have fought back or was asking for it by being there. Few fringe forums even spun wild theories about reverse, discrimination, and political correctness gone mad. But beneath all the noise, something quieter and more powerful was happening. People were talking, really talking about who gets to wear that uniform, who gets to stand in that line, and whose service counts as real. Back at the barracks, none of that mattered to the corporal. He wasn't scrolling through comments or watching news clips. He was sitting in a small windowless room with 2 senior officers and a chaplain, answering the same questions over and over. Did you recognize him? Had you seen him before? What exactly did he say? Each time he repeated the facts calmly without embellishment. He didn't add how his stomach had dropped when he heard those words. He didn't mention the cold sweat that broke out under his tunic. He just gave them what they needed, clean, usable testimony. Afterward, they offered him time off, counseling, a statement to the press if he wanted. He declined all of it, not out of pride, but because he didn't know what to say. What could he say that wouldn't sound rehearsed or angry or, worst of all, like he was playing a role? He wasn't a spokesperson. He was a soldier. And soldiers, especially ceremonial ones, weren't supposed to have opinions. They were supposed to stand still, look sharp, and disappear into the pageantry. But he couldn't disappear. Not this time. That night, alone in his flat, a small, tidy place in South London with second-hand furniture and a shelf full of history books, he finally let himself feel it. The humiliation, the injustice, the strange, hollow ache of being reduced to a symbol in someone else's hate. He poured a glass of water, sat at his kitchen table, and stared at his hands. These were the same hands that had held a rifle in training exercises, that had helped carry a fellow soldier off a muddy field during a drill gone wrong, that had shaken his grandfather's when the old man handed him his first army recruitment pamphlet. And today, those hands had stayed empty while a stranger screamed at him like he was nothing. He got up, walked to his bookshelf, and pulled out an old photo album. Inside were black and white pictures of his grandfather in uniform, standing tall beside British officers in colonial-era Africa. His grandfather never talked much about the war. When he did, it was always about the camaraderie, the discipline, the pride of serving. But the corporal had read between the lines, the way his grandfather's medals were never displayed, the way he'd been passed over for promotions, the way he'd worked as a night janitor after returning home because the army didn't hire men like him for anything else. Now, decades later, here he was, standing in the heart of London, in the very uniform his grandfather had dreamed of wearing, and still, someone saw him as an intruder. The next morning, instead of reporting for light duty as ordered, he went to the regimental archives. It was a dusty, forgotten room in the basement of an old building near Horse Guards Parade, filled with boxes of papers, faded photographs, and ledgers dating back to the 1800s. The archivist, a retired sergeant with thick glasses and a dry sense of humor, raised an eyebrow when he walked in. "You're the one from the video," the man said, not unkindly. The corporal nodded. "I need to know. Were there others like me?" The archivist didn't ask what he meant. He just sighed, pushed his glasses up his nose, and said, "Son, there've always been others like you. We just weren't always good at remembering them." What followed was a day that changed everything. Box after box revealed stories the corporal had never heard in school, never seen in museums, never encountered in the polished narratives of British military history. There was Private Elijah Thompson, a Jamaican-born soldier who fought in the trenches of World War I and was awarded the Military Medal, but whose name was misspelled in official records and later omitted from regimental rolls. There was Sergeant Amara Okoye, one of the first black women to serve in a support unit during the Falklands conflict, whose letters home spoke of both pride and isolation. And there were dozens more, men and women from Nigeria, India, the Caribbean, Ghana, whose service was documented in terse, bureaucratic language, as if their humanity was an afterthought. One file in particular caught his eye. It belonged to a soldier who'd served in the King's African Rifles, a colonial unit that fought under the British flag during World War II. The man had been recommended for a Distinguished Conduct Medal after dragging 3 wounded comrades to safety under heavy fire. But the recommendation was lost for over 50 years. It wasn't until 2006, long after the soldier had passed away, that his family finally received the medal in a quiet ceremony with no press, no fanfare. The corporal sat back, stunned. This wasn't just about him. This was about generations of people who'd given everything, sometimes their lives, and were erased from the story simply because of the color of their skin. The sword that had been stolen wasn't just a ceremonial object. It was a thread connecting him to all of them. And in that moment, he realized something. The thief hadn't just insulted him. He'd insulted every one of those forgotten soldiers, too. Meanwhile, across town, the legal machine was turning. The man who'd taken the sword, identified in court documents as Liam Crenshaw, was charged with theft, assault, and racially aggravated public order offenses. His mugshot circulated online, pale, unshaven, eyes hollow. News reports described him as unemployed, with a history of minor offenses and influenced by far-right online content. Some painted him as a monster, others as a product of neglect, A young man failed by education, family, and society. What no one knew yet was that since his arrest, Crenshaw had been unusually quiet in his cell. He hadn't bragged, hadn't ranted, hadn't doubled down. Instead, he'd asked the prison librarian for books, first on British military history, then on colonialism, then on anti-racism. He'd read late into the night under the dim bulb of his cell, his hands shaking not from withdrawal, but from something else, dawning horror at the person he'd become. Back in the barracks, the corporal's superiors grew concerned. He wasn't sleeping. He was spending all his off hours in the archives. He'd started writing. Long unsent letters to his grandfather, to the forgotten soldiers, to himself. One evening, his commanding officer pulled him aside. "You're not in trouble," the officer said gently, "but you can't carry this alone. Whatever you're feeling, it's valid, but you don't have to fix history by yourself." The corporal looked down. I need people to know we were always here, that we didn't just show up yesterday." The officer nodded. "Then maybe it's time someone told that story." That night, the corporal made a decision. He wouldn't speak to the press, not yet. But he would start collecting. He'd interview veterans, digitize old letters, compile a record that couldn't be ignored. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time since that afternoon on the Mall, he felt purpose, not just as a guard, but as a keeper of memory. And then, just as he was beginning to find his footing, a letter arrived. Not from the army, not from the media, from the prison, handwritten on thin blue paper with shaky but careful handwriting. It began, "I don't expect you to read this, but I need to say it anyway." He almost threw it away, but something made him open it. What he read inside didn't excuse what had happened. It didn't ask for forgiveness, but it was honest, painfully so. And in that honesty, the corporal saw something he hadn't expected. Not a monster, but a broken man waking up to the damage he'd caused. He read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer as his grandfather's old service pin. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning to twist in ways no one could have predicted. Because sometimes the most shocking thing isn't the act of hatred, but what grows in its aftermath. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped inside a plain white envelope with no return address, just a prison stamp and a series of numbers that meant nothing to anyone but the system that issued it. At first, the corporal didn't even open it. He left it on his kitchen table for 2 days, sitting beside a half-empty mug of tea and a stack of photocopied service records he'd pulled from the archives. He told himself he didn't need to read it. Whatever the man had to say wouldn't change what happened. Wouldn't undo the words, the glare, the way the sword had been ripped from its place like it was something dirty. But curiosity gnawed at him. Not the kind that seeks drama, but the quiet human kind, the kind that wonders what goes on behind another person's eyes when they do something terrible. So on the 3rd morning, with rain tapping against his window and the city still wrapped in gray mist, he finally tore open the envelope. The handwriting was rough, uneven, like someone unused to writing by hand. The paper smelled faintly of bleach and old ink. And the words, those were the real surprise. There was no excuse. No, "I was drunk," or "I didn't mean it." Instead, it began with a simple, startling admission. "I saw you as less than human. And that's on me, not you." He read slowly, standing by the sink, the letter trembling slightly in his fingers. The writer, the man who'd stolen the sword, described growing up in a house where hate was served like dinner. His father had ranted about immigrants, about real Englishmen, about how the country was being taken over. He'd watched videos online that twisted history into something ugly, that painted people like the corporal as invaders in their own land. For years he'd believed it. Not because he thought deeply about it, but because it was easier than questioning the only truth he'd ever known. Then came the part that made the corporal pause. Tea forgotten, breath caught in his throat. "When I saw you standing there, so still, so proud, I didn't see a person. I saw a symbol of everything I'd been taught to fear. But you didn't react. You didn't shout. You just stood. And that broke something in me. Because if you could hold your dignity after what I did, then maybe everything I believed was a lie." The letter went on. He wrote about losing his job at a warehouse after showing up late too many times. About his girlfriend leaving him when he started repeating things he'd heard in online forums. about drinking more to numb the shame of becoming someone he didn't recognize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. In fact, he wrote, "I don't deserve it. But I want to understand why I did what I did, and how to make sure I never do it again." By the time the corporal reached the end, his eyes were stinging. Not from anger, not from pity, but from something deeper, a strange, reluctant kinship. He'd spent his life proving he belonged, working twice as hard to be seen as equal, carrying the weight of representation every time he put on that uniform. And this man, he'd spent his life running from his own emptiness, filling it with poison because he didn't know how else to feel full. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with his grandfather's old service pin, the one that had never been officially recognized, but that the old man had polished every Sunday without fail. It felt right somehow. Two broken pieces of history side by side. Meanwhile, the legal case moved forward. The prosecution was preparing for trial, confident they had an open and shut case. Theft of a ceremonial weapon, public disorder, racially aggravated assault, all caught on video, witnessed by dozens. They expected a guilty plea, a short sentence, and a quick end to a messy incident. But then the defense attorney filed something unexpected, a request for a restorative justice assessment. It wasn't common in cases like this, especially not with such public attention, but it wasn't unheard of. Restorative justice focuses less on punishment and more on understanding, accountability, and, when possible, healing. It requires both parties to agree. Most victims in hate crime cases decline. The idea of sitting face-to-face with someone who targeted you feels like reopening a wound. The corporal's commanding officer handed him the paperwork with a frown. "You don't have to do this," he said. "No one would blame you for saying no." The corporal stared at the form. He thought about the letter, about the shaky handwriting, about the line that read, "I don't know how to be better, but I want to try." He thought about his grandfather who'd once told him, "Hate only wins if you let it live inside you." He signed the form. The process took weeks. Interviews with mediators, psychological evaluations, strict confidentiality agreements. Both men had to agree to ground rules: no shouting, no accusations, no walking out. The meeting would be voluntary, monitored, and could be stopped at any time. It wasn't about absolution. It was about truth. During that time, the corporal kept working. He visited a retired sergeant from Barbados who'd served in the 1970s and still kept his uniform pressed in a closet, just in case they ever need me again. He tracked down the daughter of a Nigerian-born medic who'd saved dozens of lives during the Suez Crisis, but was never mentioned in official histories. He started compiling their stories into a small digital archive, not for fame, but for memory. "If we don't tell these stories," he told a friend over coffee, "they disappear, and then it's like we were never here at all." At the same time, in his cell, the other man was changing too. He'd stopped watching the news, stopped scrolling through old forums. Instead, he read books about the British Empire, about the Windrush generation, about soldiers from the colonies who fought for a crown that wouldn't let their children attend the same schools. He wrote more letters, not just to the corporal, but to community groups asking how he could help if he ever got out. He even started attending a prison discussion group on prejudice and identity, something he would have mocked just months before. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, neither man slept well. The room was plain, beige walls, 2 chairs, a small table, a window with reinforced glass. A trained facilitator sat off to the side, quiet but present. The corporal arrived first in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a simple shirt, no uniform, no medals. He wanted to be seen as a person, not a symbol. A few minutes later, the other man walked in, flanked by a guard. He looked thinner, paler. His hands were clean, his hair cut short. He didn't look at the corporal right away. He just stood by the door, breathing like he'd run a mile. "Have a seat," the facilitator said gently. He did. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was heavy, full of everything unsaid. Then the corporal spoke first. "Why me?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. There were other guards. "Why did you pick me?" The man looked down at his hands. "Because you were different," he said quietly. "Not just your skin. The way you held yourself, like you belonged there. And that scared me. Because if you belonged, then everything I'd been told was wrong. The corporal nodded slowly. And now? Now I know it was wrong, he said, voice cracking. I read about men like you, men who served in wars I didn't even know happened. Men who died for this country and got nothing but silence in return. And I stood there and called you an imposter. He swallowed hard. I'm ashamed. The corporal didn't soften immediately. He let the shame sit there raw and unvarnished. Then he said, my grandfather served in the King's African Rifles. He carried wounded soldiers through gunfire. When he came home, they wouldn't let him live in certain neighborhoods. Wouldn't hire him for anything but cleaning jobs. But every Sunday, he'd put on his old uniform jacket and stand in front of the mirror like he was still on duty. He never stopped believing in the idea of service, even when the country forgot him. The man across from him wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I didn't know any of that, he whispered. I didn't want to know. But you do now, the corporal said. That's what matters. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Not just about the theft, but about fear. About lies passed down like heirlooms, about how easy it is to hate what you don't understand. The corporal didn't offer forgiveness, not in words. But he listened. And in that listening, something shifted. Not a miracle. Not a Hollywood ending. But a crack in the wall between them, just wide enough for light to get through. Afterward, outside the building, the corporal stood in the cool evening air and took a deep breath. He didn't feel lighter exactly, but he felt clearer. This wasn't about one man's apology. It was about breaking a cycle. And maybe, just maybe, he'd played a part in that. Back inside, the other man sat alone in the waiting area, head in his hands. For the first time in years, he didn't feel angry. He felt responsible. And responsibility, he was starting to learn, was the first step toward becoming someone new. What happened next wouldn't make headlines, but it would ripple outward, in quiet choices, in changed minds, in a sword that would one day tell a different kind of story. Because sometimes the most shocking thing isn't the crime. It's the courage it takes to face it, and to grow from it. The courtroom was smaller than most people expected, more like a classroom than the grand halls shown on television. Pale walls, scuffed linoleum floors, rows of hard wooden benches that creaked when you shifted. Sunlight filtered through high windows, casting long rectangles across the floor, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. It was here on a gray Monday morning in early autumn that the man who'd stolen the sword stood before the judge, hands clasped in front of him, eyes fixed on the worn carpet. He wasn't in chains. He wasn't shouting. He looked, if anything, exhausted, like someone who'd been carrying a weight too heavy for too long and had finally set it down, only to find his arms still ached from the strain. His lawyer stood beside him, calm and measured, while the prosecutor sat across the aisle, papers neatly stacked, expression unreadable. The corporal wasn't there to testify. He'd already given his statement. But he'd asked to attend the sentencing, not out of curiosity, but because he felt he owed it to the moment, to see it through to the end. He sat in the back row, in plain clothes, blending in with the handful of journalists and curious onlookers. No one recognized him at first. To them, he was just another face in the crowd. And for once, that felt like a relief. The judge, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, read through the file slowly. She'd seen hundreds of cases like this, petty theft, public disorder, drunken outbursts. But this one was different. Not just because of the location or the victim, but because of what had happened afterward. She'd read the restorative justice report. She'd reviewed the letters, the prison logs, the notes from the mediator. And she'd taken the unusual step of requesting a character reference, not from family or friends, but from someone unexpected. When the corporal's name was called, a quiet rustle went through the room. Heads turned. Whispers followed. He walked to the front with the same steady pace he used on parade, but without the stiffness. Just a man moving through space with purpose. He didn't look at the defendant. Not yet. I'm not here to ask for punishment, he began, voice low but clear. I'm here to say that what happened that day wasn't just about a sword. It was about who gets to be seen as belonging. And for a long time, people like me have been told we don't. But we've been here, serving, sacrificing, loving this country even when it didn't love us back. He paused, glancing at the man for the first time. Their eyes met, briefly, honestly. This man did something wrong. There's no denying that. But since then, he's done something harder. He's looked at himself. Really looked. And that takes courage most people don't have. I don't know if he'll stay on this path. No one does. But I believe he deserves a chance to try, not for my sake, but for his own. He stepped down without another word. The room stayed silent for a beat too long, as if everyone was holding their breath. The judge nodded slowly. Then she turned to the defendant. "You've heard what was said. Do you have anything to add?" He stood. His voice was quiet but steady. "I just want to say thank you," he said, looking at the corporal. "Not for forgiving me, I don't expect that, but for seeing me as someone who could change. That meant more than I can say." The judge considered everything: the crime, the remorse, the unusual steps taken toward accountability, the lack of prior violent history, the support plan already in place through a local anti-hate organization. In the end, she handed down a suspended sentence, 12 months with strict conditions: mandatory counseling, 200 hours of community service, a ban from the palace grounds, and, most unusually, a requirement to participate in an educational program about Britain's diverse military history, if one became available. It wasn't leniency. It was investment. A bet on the possibility of change. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. "Do you feel justice was served? Will you speak to him again? What's next for you?" The corporal declined to comment. He walked away without looking back, disappearing into the London crowd like any other citizen. But he wasn't just any citizen anymore. Something had shifted, not just in the courtroom but inside him. He'd gone in expecting to witness an ending. Instead, he'd helped plant a seed. Over the next few weeks, he threw himself into work, not just his duties, but the quiet project he'd started in the archives. He reached out to historians, to veterans groups, to teachers. He proposed a traveling exhibit: real stories, real artifacts, real voices from the overlooked corners of British military service. He called it Guardians of Memory, not flashy, not political, just human. To his surprise, people listened. A small museum in East London offered space. A retired colonel donated a collection of letters from soldiers in the West India regiments. A schoolteacher volunteered to help design lesson plans for teenagers. And then, quietly, without fanfare, the man from the courthouse reached out through his probation officer. He didn't ask to speak, didn't ask to be featured. He just asked if there was anything he could do: move boxes, set up displays, clean floors. Anything to be part of something that mattered. The corporal thought about it for a long time. Part of him wanted to say no. Trust isn't rebuilt in a day. But another part remembered the look in the man's eyes during their meeting. The raw, unguarded regret that couldn't be faked. So he said yes, with conditions: supervision, no direct contact with school groups, just behind-the-scenes help. The first time they saw each other again was in the museum's storage room, surrounded by crates of uniforms, medals, and old photographs. The man arrived early, wearing work boots and a plain jacket, hair neatly combed. He didn't say much, just nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and started unpacking a box labeled North Africa Campaign, 1942. The corporal watched for a moment, then joined him. They worked in silence for an hour, sorting documents, labeling frames, arranging display stands. No grand speeches, no dramatic reconciliation, just two men doing a job side by side, in a room full of ghosts who deserved to be remembered. Later, during a break, the man picked up a faded photo of a black soldier standing proudly beside a tank in the desert. "Who's this?" he asked. "Private Kofi Mensah," the corporal said. "Fought at El Alamein. Saved 3 men when their vehicle was hit. Got a commendation. But it took 40 years for his family to get a copy." The man stared at the photo for a long time. "I never learned about him in school," he said quietly. "Most people didn't," the corporal replied. "But that's why we're doing this." As the exhibit took shape, something unexpected happened. The story, the real story, not the viral clip, started to spread. Local newspapers ran features. A documentary crew asked to film the setup. School groups signed up weeks in advance. And at every event, in the back of the room, the man was there, stacking chairs, testing projectors, making sure the display lights worked. He never spoke unless spoken to, but he listened, and he learned. One afternoon, a group of teenagers toured the exhibit. They were loud at first, shuffling and joking, until they reached a case containing a single battered rifle and a letter written in careful cursive. The corporal stood nearby, watching as their teacher read the letter aloud. A final message from a Nigerian-born private to his mother, written the night before he died in Normandy. The room grew quiet. One boy, maybe 15, turned to the corporal and asked, "Did they ever say thank you to him?" The corporal shook his head. "Not while he was alive. But we're saying it now." After the group left, the man who'd once stolen the sword stood by the same case, staring at the rifle. His eyes were wet, but he didn't wipe them away. "I used to think history was just kings and battles," he said, voice rough. "I didn't know it was also people like this." "That's the point," the corporal said. "History isn't just what's written in books. It's what we choose to remember." They didn't become friends. That would have been too neat, too easy. But they became something else. Two people bound by a terrible moment who chose slowly and imperfectly to build something better from it. Not for applause, not for redemption, but because it was the right thing to do. And in a world that often feels divided, that quiet choice to show up, to listen, to try again, might be the most shocking thing of all. A year after the sword was stolen, it sat behind glass in a quiet corner of a small museum in East London, lit by a soft spotlight that made the polished steel gleam like it held secrets. The label beneath it read simply, "Recovered, restored, remembered." No dramatic headlines. No mention of the man who'd taken it. Just those 3 words, quiet, dignified, final. Visitors often paused there longer than expected. Not because the sword was ornate. It wasn't. It was a standard-issue ceremonial blade, worn from decades of use. But because of the story that came with it. Not the viral clip of the theft, but the quieter, deeper story that unfolded afterward. The kind that doesn't trend online but lingers in the heart. The exhibit around it had grown far beyond what anyone imagined. What started as a modest collection of letters and photographs had become Guardians of Memory, a traveling showcase of Britain's overlooked military heroes, soldiers from Ghana, Jamaica, India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and beyond, whose service had been quietly folded into the margins of official history. School children came in groups wide-eyed, tracing the names on display with their fingers. Teachers used the materials in lessons about identity, belonging, and the cost of forgetting. Veterans showed up unannounced, some in wheelchairs, some with medals pinned crookedly to old blazers, just to see their own stories reflected for the first time. And in the background, always, was the man who'd once stood on the mall shouting hate. He never gave speeches, never stood at the front. But he was there, early in the morning, unlocking storage rooms, testing microphones before school visits, carefully dusting display cases with a soft cloth. He wore a volunteer badge that said only support staff, and most visitors didn't know his story. Those who did, like the museum director or the probation officer who checked in monthly, saw something remarkable. Not a reformed villain, but a man learning, slowly and humbly, how to be useful. He still attended counseling, still read books, now on post-colonial history, on restorative practices, on the psychology of prejudice. He'd even started writing again, not letters this time, but reflections he shared only with his therapist. "I used to think changing meant becoming someone else," he wrote once. "Now I think it means finally becoming who you were supposed to be all along." Meanwhile, the corporal had been promoted, not for what happened that day, but for the work that came after. He still served in ceremonial duties, still stood in silence under the summer sun, but now he also traveled to schools, not in uniform but in a sweater and trousers. Speaking not as a symbol but as a storyteller, he talked about his grandfather, about Private Kofi Mensah, about the medic from Lagos who saved dozens during the Suez Crisis, but was never invited to a single veterans reunion. He didn't preach. He just shared, and in sharing, he gave others permission to see history as something alive, something personal. One rainy afternoon in late spring, a group of students from a school in Croydon visited the exhibit. They were rowdy at first, laughing, nudging each other, snapping selfies near the entrance. But as they moved through the room, something shifted. They slowed. They read the captions. They asked questions. At the final display, the sword, they gathered in a loose semicircle, unusually quiet. Their teacher, a young woman with kind eyes, turned to the corporal, who'd been observing from a distance. "Would you mind answering a question from one of my students?" He nodded and stepped forward. A boy, no older than 13, with curly hair and scuffed trainers, raised his hand. Did you ever want to hurt him? He asked, voice small but clear. The man who took your sword? Did you ever want revenge? The room went still. Even the museum staff paused what they were doing. It was the question everyone had wondered, but no one had dared to ask so plainly. The corporal looked at the boy, then at the sword behind glass, then out the window at the gray London sky. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm like water smoothing stone. Revenge closes doors, he said. It locks you in the past with the person who hurt you. But truth? Truth builds bridges even if they're shaky at first. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted him to see me. Really see me. And when he finally did, that was enough. The boy nodded slowly as if storing the words away for later. Then he asked, "Is he here today?" The corporal glanced toward the back of the room, where the man was adjusting a display light near the exit. He caught his eye for just a second, a look that held no judgment, only acknowledgement. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning back to his work. "He's here," the corporal said softly, "not as the man who stole the sword, but as someone trying to help others remember." After the students left, the man approached. He didn't say much, just handed the corporal a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something," he said, "for the archive, if you think it's worth keeping." Inside was a short essay titled, "What I Learned from a Sword." It wasn't polished. It had grammatical errors, but it was honest about shame, about ignorance, about the moment he realized that hating someone was easier than understanding them, and how that ease had cost him everything. At the end, he wrote, "I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can help make sure someone else doesn't do the same." The corporal read it twice. Then he placed it in a new folder labeled Voices of Change and added it to the exhibit's educational materials. Months passed. The exhibit toured to Manchester, then Bristol, then Glasgow. Each stop drew crowds, not huge ones, but steady, thoughtful ones. At every location, the sword traveled with them, always in its simple case, always with the same 3-word label. People left notes in a guest book nearby. "Thank you for remembering. My grandfather was from Trinidad. He never talked about the war. I didn't know our history was this big." Back in London, the original display became permanent. The museum expanded its hours. Volunteers signed up by the dozen, and the man who'd once been a symbol of hate became quietly a symbol of something else, the possibility of change, not through grand gestures, but through showing up day after day and doing the work. One evening, long after closing, the corporal stayed late to organize new donations, a collection of diaries from a Sikh regiment, photographs from a Caribbean airman, a faded beret with a regimental patch barely visible. The man was there too, packing away unused stands. They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Then the man spoke, not looking up. "Do you ever think about that day?" "On the Mall." "Every now and then," the corporal said. "But not like I used to. What do you think about now?" "That it wasn't the end of my story," he said. "Or yours," the man nodded. "I used to think I was nothing. Now I think, maybe I can be something small, something useful." "That's more than most people ever try to be," the corporal replied. Outside, the city hummed, buses rolling, distant sirens, the soft patter of rain beginning again. Inside, under the warm glow of work lamps, 2 men who'd once stood on opposite sides of a terrible moment now stood side by side, surrounded by the ghosts of those who'd served in silence. And in that quiet room, filled with paper and memory and the weight of history, something new was being built, not with swords, but with stories, because in the end, what shocks people isn't violence or hatred. Those are sadly familiar. What truly surprises them, what lingers long after the headlines fade, is when someone chooses to heal instead of harden, to listen instead of lash out, to remember instead of erase, and sometimes, just sometimes, a stolen sword becomes the key that unlocks a door no one even knew was closed.